I'm going to talk a little bit about wheat diseases and wheat fungicide use. And I'm also going to include some comments about small grains as well. I think we're aware that we have a little bit of an unusual year developing at this point in time. It was dry through most of the fall. As a result, a lot of the wheat and other small grains that are grown both as for cover crops, forages, and for grain didn't get planted. Or if they did, they didn't get planted until the end of November and into December. So we've got a little unusual situation this year in that the crop, such as it is going to be very late, which when you talk about diseases is actually a bit of a positive in that not having the winter cover, game food, and some of the forage plots out there, which are usually planted maybe even as early as late September into early October, can serve as an inoculum source for foliar diseases as well as viruses in small grains, and they're basically not there. So in all likelihood, we've got less inoculum pressure going into this year than maybe we've had in the recent past. So that's, from that standpoint, that's actually a positive. Because some of these other crops do serve a source, particularly for rust disease. Now, of course, depending on what the weather does from now into early April will determine really whether or not we have some serious problems or not. If the weather stays cold as it was this week, that'll pretty well shut down all the diseases that we might be concerned with that could develop over the winter. If it gets wet out, particularly if it warms up a bit and stays wet, under those circumstances, we're more likely to see more disease activity in wheat and other small grains. So we'll just have to wait and see what the weather does from now on out as to how much inoculum pressure we're going to run into. And how do we change?
Did you do like a page down?
Yeah, I tried that.
This happened to us yesterday. Eddie and I were having some issues with PowerPoint.
Oh, wait a minute.
Do next.
Yeah.
Let's try that.
There we go.
Hopefully
We'll have
to
work our way through it.
Yeah.
All right. As far as rust diseases are concerned, there are three primary rusts in wheat, and we see some similar rusts in other small grains as well. Leaf rust, the image at the top, is definitely the most common rust disease that we see on wheat. We see very similar diseases on barley and oats as well. They can get established on wheat in the wintertime, but develop very rapidly in late winter and early spring under the right weather conditions. We almost never see stem rust. It's only shown up a few times in years past. Yellow or stripe rust does show up some in the Tennessee Valley. Don't really see it anywhere else in the state very often. It is very variety specific, and at least over the last few years in rating plots, it's very variety specific, and most of our commercial varieties really do not have serious issues with yellow rust. So the main one is that we're concerned about is leaf rust, and it's fully capable of reducing yields when it's not controlled on a susceptible variety by up to 50%. In recent years, we've done some work on oats with crown rust, and on oats, for example, that yield loss can approach 100% given the right circumstances. So normally we're really looking for a rust in mid to late March, and it develops rapidly from that point on. As I said before, wet weather does bring it or accelerate the development of rust. And as far as the state is concerned, and this is true with foliar diseases in general, is that they're more you tend to see more issues with them, and they're much more severe the closer you get to the coast. And then they tend to be less of an issue as you go further north, particularly in the Tennessee Valley. Most of the varieties do differ in their reaction to rust, although most of the ones we have in the market are not particularly susceptible. And one of the problems in managing diseases of the rust diseases is we're always using resistance as a really effective tool for managing these diseases. But over time, the genes, you'll develop races of the rust fungi that can defeat the genes that are available in many of our varieties. And in other parts of the world, that is happening with stem rust. Bloom blotch and septoria leaf blotch are two other diseases that we run into a good deal in the state of Alabama on wheat. I don't think they have the potential to reduce yields as much as rust does, but they can look ugly, and you can have a lot of damage, particularly from bloom blotch damaging the seed heads. So you would tend to see a reduction in seed test weight in those situations. So the bloom blotch is definitely the more damaging of the two, and is more of a statewide distribution. The septoria leaf blotch, I've only really ever seen it in the Tennessee Valley, and it does cause on some varieties noticeable leaf blighting, but as long as it doesn't get into the tops of the plants, it's really not having that much impact on yield. And it's oftentimes in the field trials that have been run in the state of Alabama, it's not always very easy to show a yield increase from fungicide use for control of these types of blotch diseases. But they're definitely like the rust. They are rainfall driven, so when we have a lot of wet, mild weather in mid-March on through the 1st of May, that's really going to push those diseases to develop. Mildew, we're kind of declining in severity. Mildew is oftentimes very showy, but its effects on yield are less than perhaps some of these other diseases. It tends to be a problem when we use too high a seeding rate or in turn rows, or where we get a doubling over of nitrogen rates, are those areas where you tend to see moisture mildew. On some varieties and some circumstances, given the right weather patterns, it can turn wheat white, and it'll colonize. The fungus will colonize virtually every above ground part of a wheat plant. So it's not unusual to see powdery mildew on the seed heads. It tends to be a mild, cloudy weather disease, but if it rains a lot, that tends to actually suppress powdery mildew. So overall, it tends to have a lot less impact on yield than the other two diseases that I mentioned. And a lot of our varieties are fairly resistant to this disease. One disease that's gotten more attention in the past 4 or 5 years has been scab. It's not only the blighting of the seed head, because it's basically the only part of the plant that is affected by scab, but it's also the causal fungus produces mycotoxins. And we've had issues with this disease, particularly in the last 4 or 5 years, and the buying points simply are not interested in purchasing scab-damaged wheat. A few years ago, they bought some and they got stuck with it, couldn't get rid of it. Most of our wheat goes into the baking industry, and the mycotoxins tolerance levels are fairly low for food stocks, and there are some other issues that come up with having mycotoxin contaminated grain. So they simply are not going to buy it. This is a disease that really does need to be controlled. It specifically develops when we have a lot of rain during flowering. If it's dry during flowering, you won't have issues with scab. But if you get a couple of showers in there, when the wheat is in bloom, and you get right temperature patterns, it could be off to the races. And this disease is specifically linked with corn production. So overall, it's not a good idea to plant wheat after corn, particularly if the corn has been no-tilled. The Fusarium fungus that causes scab in wheat also causes Fusarium stalk rot and Gibberella ear rot in corn. So when you're planting wheat into corn stubble, there's a ready inoculum source, and the disease is much more likely to be a problem there. But we've seen scab outbreaks in wheat behind cotton, so it's just not only corn is vulnerable, or wheat behind corn. And as I mentioned, we do have the mycotoxin issues with vomitoxins, zearalones, and some other fumonisin toxins. And I mentioned here that you would get a significant discount at the elevator, but the reality is they don't want scabby wheat. And the other issue is some growers will grow wheat as animal feed, and those mycotoxins are an issue for some animals. Probably beef cattle are the least sensitive, but when you get into animals with simple stomachs, hogs, and some birds, scabby wheat's a real problem, and it's going to cause a lot of issues. So its value as a feed material or feed additive is minimal. If you look at some of the other symptoms of scab, if you look at a seed head that's been infected but not really showing a lot of symptoms, you'll see a distinct peak discoloration around the glume. That's the fungus sporulating on the tissue. If you go a few more weeks where the seed heads have already bleached out, you'll see clusters of small black bodies around the base of the seed and the base of the glumes. Those are the sexual fruiting structures of the Fusarium fungus. It's a Gibberella sexual stage. And of course, that's diagnostic for identifying scab in wheat. If you look at the damaged kernels, they tend to be greatly reduced in size and have a distinct pink cast to them as compared with a normal light or medium tan grain. And in image D, you can just clearly see the difference between the healthy and the scabby wheat. There is a model out there that growers can use, as well as the agents, to monitor scab development in either their crop or their area. It's a weather-based forecasting model, and at least gives the growers and you an idea as to whether or not scab is likely to develop, and then based on the forecast, the growers can then decide whether or not they want to come back with a over-the-top fungicide treatment. And these are the websites where this model can be accessed. Of course, right now it's down, but it'll start back up in the middle of March. We get into fungicide use, it gets to be an economics and insurance question. Fungicides typically are very similar to buying term life insurance. You're getting some protection for a short period of time. We're primarily targeting these foliar diseases that I talked about. When you get into some of the soil-borne diseases like take-all, root rot, there's nothing we can do about that. Economics-wise, we need at least 50 or maybe 60 bushels per acre yield potential in order to even begin to cover the cost of the fungicides, and then maybe get some additional income benefit from the fungicide. Or if a grower is producing foundation or certified seed, which has a higher value than just bin run wheat seed or other small grains, then there's a income potential gain from using a fungicide, as well as a quality benefit on top of any yield gains, because you get a much plumper and larger seed as a result, more uniform seed. You know, over the years, as I mentioned earlier, we tend to see more disease issues in Southwest Alabama or South Alabama than we do anywhere else in the state as far as wheat is concerned. So in those high disease pressure areas, those are the locations when we tend to see a yield benefit and an income benefit out of using fungicides. And we're particularly addressing the rust diseases, septoria, powdery mildew. When you get into scab, it's a little bit different situation because we can have scab outbreaks anywhere in the state. In the past, they used to think and used to have more issues, it seemed like, with it in the Tennessee Valley, but in the last 3 or 4 years, we've had severe scab outbreaks down, for example, in Baldwin County. So the disease does have a statewide distribution, and it doesn't matter where it develops. It's going to cause the same issues with poor grain quality and the mycotoxin contamination. So for scab issues, if the risk is high, regardless of where you are in the state, you may need to spray. So we like to see folks scout fields, several locations in each field to monitor the foliar disease that we talked about. Monitor weather patterns, because the wetter it is, the warmer it is, the more likely you are to have disease issues. There are a lot of fungicides in the marketplace, so growers need to look at what their disease spectrum is, how much cost they want to put into the crop, and make an appropriate fungicide decision. There are generics out there that are relatively inexpensive and will provide adequate control in moderate disease pressure situations, but they're also, particularly in some of the name brand products, are the go-to materials when you're under high disease pressure. And growers, particularly if they scout, have the option of coming with 1 or 2 applications. And this is just a listing of all the products that are available for use on small grains. Just about, or in fact, all of them are labeled for use on wheat. When you get into barley, oats, and triticale, you gotta pick and choose a little bit because some of them are labeled, some of them are not. And when you're dealing with a food and feed crop, you do have to make sure that the product is registered specifically for that crop, and not just assume because it's a small grain that you can apply it to whatever crop you want to. Very quickly, I'm just going to touch on barley yellow dwarf. I'm sure Kathy's going to talk a little bit more about aphid management, so I'm going to leave all that to her, but it is an aphid transmitted virus disease, green bug being the primary vector, but there's probably more, and a lot more, and probably with the conditions we've had this year, it's going to be less of a problem. And it's mainly, we can avoid the problem with early planting and some insecticide programs. So basically, that's all I had to go over today. And if there's anything that I need to address, let me know. Drop me an email, and we'll try and get the information out. Thank you.
I got a question for you, and Brandon may have some later. I run into this with the insecticides, because it's lots of times people can't afford to be scouting their wheat, because especially with the prices the way they are. If you can only put a fungicide on once in North, Central, and South Alabama, when would you put that fungicide on?
If we're not talking about scab, when the flag leaf is fully emerged, because we want to, the most important thing is that the flag leaf stay intact as long as possible.
Okay, so that's going to be key right there. Yes. In your mind. And then if weather conditions are right and they can use the forecast rather than scouting. Right, with the scab, you've got to do that one, but that's a much later spray. Yeah, with the scab, you're going to have to use the. You either base it on weather patterns and cropping history, or you can use the weather-based model as a means of determining whether or not you want to go ahead and apply a fungicide. Because when you deal with scab, you are dealing with name brand products, and probably Prosero is the preferred material at this point in time, Carumba being the other one. And so, and those are expensive treatments and really only need to be used in situations where they're more than likely the grower's going to see a quality and a yield benefit.